She stood alone behind that counter with 8 armed riders in the yard, a man offering her $1,500 to disappear, and not one person in the building who could help her. She had arrived in this valley 3 months earlier with 11 cents a hole in her boot and a wedding ring she was willing to trade for bread. What happened between those two moments is a story about what a woman carries when she has nothing left and what she finds when she finally puts it down. The hand that slid across the counter did not tremble. Rose Whitfield had spent the better part of the morning making certain of that. She had pressed her palms together in the alley behind Briggs' General Store for nearly 10 minutes, pressing them until the cold of the October air worked its way through her gloves and steadied what 6 months of grief and hunger and relentless forward motion had not quite managed to break. When she finally walked through the door and approached the counter, her hand was still. The rest of her was not, but the hand was. And the hand was what mattered. The ring caught the thin light filtering through the front window of Briggs' General Store in Clearwater Ridge, Montana territory. It was a plain band of gold, unadorned, the kind of ring a careful man saves for months to afford when he wants to give the woman he loves something that means what he means it to mean. William Whitfield had bought it in Columbus, Ohio in the spring of 1870. He had presented it to her across a modest dinner table with the particular pride of a methodical man who has done something impulsive for the first time in his life and found it suits him better than he expected. She had worn it through 18 months of marriage through the fever ward of Columbus General Hospital, where she held his hand and watched his breathing slow, and through 6 months of everything that came after. She had sold his surveying equipment. She had sold his books, his good coat, the small writing desk he had built for her from pine boards during the winter of their first year. She had kept the ring until today. Mr. Briggs looked at the ring the way a man looks at something he does not want to be responsible for. He was heavy-set gray at the temples with the kind eyes of someone who had spent 20 years on the frontier watching the parade of desperate people it produced and had learned that kindness and the ability to help were not always the same thing. He studied the ring for a long moment. He did not reach for it. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, and his voice was genuinely sorry, "I've told you already. Gold doesn't spend easy out here. What folks need before winter is strong backs for wood cutting and fence mending, not jewelry." He pushed the ring back toward her with one thick finger slowly as if the slowness might soften it. "You'd be better off trying the mining camps north of here or the fort." The mining camps were 40 miles north in weather that had already turned mean. The fort was 2 days east. Between her and either of those options stood 11 cents no horse and a left boot with a hole in the sole that she had plugged with folded newspaper 2 weeks ago. The newspaper had since dissolved in the mud of Clearwater Ridge's single main street, and she could feel the cold of the boardwalk through the gap. She looked at the ring on the counter between them and thought about what it meant that the world could reduce a person to this. Not dramatically, not with any of the grandeur that suffering sometimes pretended to have in the books she had read in her former life. Just a counter and a kind man who could not help her in a circle of gold that had once meant everything and now might not be worth a week of cornmeal. "Just a loaf of bread," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. "Or cornmeal, dried beans, anything." The bell above the door chimed behind her. She did not turn around. She was focused on the particular task of not letting anything show on her face, and turning around required a kind of general reorientation that she could not afford just then. The voice that came from behind her was the kind of voice that filled a room without effort, deep and unhurried, carrying the quality of a man accustomed to projecting across open distances where the wind was always competing. "Something wrong here, Briggs." "No trouble, Mr. Stoneridge. Just explaining to this lady that we don't do trade in gold." She turned. The man who had entered was Ethan Stoneridge, though she did not know his name yet. What she knew in the first few seconds of looking at him was the following. He was tall in the way that men who work under open sky become tall, not merely in height, but in presence, as though the body learns to take up the space that the landscape demands of it. He was built from labor rather than from any intention toward physical impressiveness. the kind of frame assembled by 20 years of hauling timber and wrestling livestock in fighting weather, rather than by any desire to appear a certain way. His clothes were canvas and leather worn at exactly the places where work wore things, at the elbows, in the inner wrist, and the knees. His face was the face of a man who had spent his 30s in the sun, deeply tanned with the lines of squinting into long distances, already establishing themselves around eyes the color of good whiskey amber with gold in it. Those eyes took her in quickly, thoroughly, and without sentimentality. She had been looked at that way by men before and had not liked it. This was different. He was not looking at her the way a man looks at a woman. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a problem he is trying to understand correctly before he decides what to do about it. The wedding ring on the counter, the travel-worn dress of quality wool gone thin at the hem, the careful posture, the hollow cheeks she had not quite managed to fill in the 2 weeks since her last real meal, the pride, the hunger underneath it. He looked for perhaps 3 seconds. Then he looked at Briggs. "Get her what she needs," he said. "Put it on my account." Rose felt the words land in her chest like cold water. Charity. 6 months of navigating the frontier's particular economy of desperation had taught her what charity felt like from the inside. And it felt like confirmation of the thing she feared most, that she had become the kind of person other people needed to manage a problem in human form, a burden distributed among the willing. She had accepted it twice before when the alternative was genuine physical collapse, and both times it had cost her something she could not quite name and could not quite get back. She straightened her shoulders. "I haven't asked for charity, Mr. Stoneridge." Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, exactly. Something closer to recognition, as though he had been looking for a particular quality and had just located it in an unexpected place. He stepped fully into the store. He removed his hat. He held it in both hands and looked at her with the directness of a man who has never had the patience for circling around the point he needs to make. "No," he said, "you haven't." He walked to the counter, not quickly, and stood at an appropriate distance, the hat still in his hands. "My name is Ethan Stoneridge. My brothers and I run a ranch and trading post about 6 miles north up the mountain road. We lost our cook 2 months ago when she married a trapper out of Oregon Territory. We have 8 ranch hands, a trading post that needs operating through the winter months, and not one person on the property capable of producing a meal worth sitting down for." He paused for a moment, letting that settle. "If you can cook and you're not afraid of hard work, we have a position available, room board and fair wages." Rose stared at him. In 6 months of desperation, she had been offered pity, occasional charity, unsolicited advice, and the particular species of kindness that comes wrapped in condescension. She had not been offered a job, a transaction, something she could accept without the accompanying loss of some essential piece of herself that, as far as she could tell, she could not afford to lose. "I can cook," she said, because it was true. "Then we'd be obliged if you'd consider the position." He turned to Briggs. "Get her trail supplies and provisions for the road. Proper ones." Then back to her. "There's a boarding house across the street. Mrs. Hartwell runs it. She serves a fair noon meal. Eat, rest if you need to, and I'll come back with the wagon in 2 hours." She looked at him steadily. "I haven't accepted your offer yet." The corner of his mouth moved by perhaps 1/8 of an inch. "No, ma'am, you haven't, but you're still standing here, and you haven't walked out." He moved toward the door. Then he stopped, one hand on the frame, and looked back at her. His voice dropped by half a register, not softer exactly, but more precise, as though the sentence required more care than the ones before it. "Keep that ring. Out here, we don't trade away our memories. We just learn to carry them different." The door closed behind him. The store held its silence for a long moment. One of the 2 men at the far end who had stopped their conversation when the exchange began quietly resumed it. Briggs exhaled through his nose and began moving toward the shelves with the particular efficiency of a man who has received clear instructions and intends to follow them. "Ethan Stoneridge is a good man," he said, not looking at her. "His father's fair. It's honest work they're offering. He paused at the shelf of cornmeal. Been a long time since that ranch had a woman's hand in it. Rose picked up the ring from the counter and closed her fingers around it. Through the store's front window, she watched Ethan Stoneridge mount his horse with the economy of motion that belonged to a man who had been riding since before he could properly see over the saddle horn. He sat for a moment looking back at the store with an expression she could not read at this distance. Then he touched the brim of his hat, turned the horse north, and rode out of sight in a steady cloud of October dust. She put the ring back on her finger. She was not ready to stop wearing it. But she thought for the first time in 6 months that there might eventually be a difference between carrying a memory and being buried under its weight. Mrs. Hartwell's boarding house was a two-story building of weathered clapboard that had, as the woman herself said without apology, seen considerably better days and remained standing through sheer stubbornness. The proprietress was small and bird-like, with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, and the particular competence of a woman who has run a successful operation for 20 years by being consistently right about people. She looked Rose up and down in the doorway before saying a word. Then she stepped aside and gestured toward a small table near the kitchen window. "Daniel Stoneridge sent you," she said, and then corrected herself immediately. "Ethan, I always mix them up. Ethan sent you." "He suggested I come," Rose said. "Same thing when Ethan suggested." Mrs. Hartwell set a plate of beef stew and cornbread on the table with the decisive action of a woman who has already determined what a person needs before they have sat down long enough to work it out themselves. "Eat. We can talk while you do." Rose ate slowly the way she had learned to eat when food was available. The body, once frightened enough by genuine scarcity, developed an irrational urgency around meals that had to be consciously managed. She used the time to listen. Mrs. Hartwell had opinions about the Stoneridge family offered freely, and in the manner of a local historian who takes the responsibility seriously. Abel Stoneridge had come to this part of Montana Territory in the early 1850s, before most of the territory had a name that anyone agreed on, and had built Stoneridge Ranch and trading post from raw land and pine timber, and the particular stubbornness of a man who had decided this was where he was going to plant himself and was not interested in reconsidering. His wife, Agnes Ney Harper, had been a school teacher from Pennsylvania who came west expecting to educate a generation of frontier children and instead married Abel Stoneridge and spent 30 years making a home in the wilderness with the same fierce competence she would have brought to a Philadelphia schoolroom. She insisted on proper meals even during roundup, Mrs. Hartwell said, refilling Rose's coffee without being asked. Said civilization started at the dinner table, made all three boys learn to read and write properly, made Abel learn to read poetry, which he hated, but did because she asked him to. She sat down across from Rose with her own cup. When she died 2 years ago, something went out of that place. The men kept it running because Abel Stoneridge would not permit anything he had built to fail. But running and living are not the same thing, and I think even Abel knows that. "And the 3 sons," Rose said. "Ethan is the oldest, 34, and he carries every one of those years in the way he holds himself. He was engaged once a few years back. Girl from the Flathead Valley, pretty and educated. Came to visit the ranch and decided the mountains were not for her. Left the morning after she told him." Mrs. Hartwell's expression suggested her view of this woman. "Ethan went quiet after that. Quieter than he already was, which was saying something. He puts everything into the ranch now. Cole is the middle one, 30, and he has his mother's ability to find the humor in a situation which has saved the family from becoming entirely grim on more than one occasion. Smarter than he lets on, which is a useful quality." A pause. "And Grant is the youngest, 26 and still young enough to believe that enthusiasm is a substitute for experience. Agnes's favorite, though she'd never have said so." Rose turned the coffee cup in her hands. "Mrs. Hartwell, there's a man named Crane I've heard mentioned in connection with the ranch. Victor Crane." The older woman's expression changed, not dramatically, but the warmth that had been in it cooled by several degrees. "Crane Timber and Land Company," she said. "Victor Crane has been after Stoneridge's water rights for 3 years. Clearwater Creek runs through Stoneridge land, and Crane wants to control that watershed. He's been working the territorial courts. has enough money to make things uncomfortable for the Stoneridges without ever quite crossing into anything a marshal could act on. She set down her cup with precision. Abel Stoneridge has been in this valley longer than Victor Crane has been in the territory. But patience and longevity don't always win against money and lawyers, and that is a thing that keeps me awake some nights. Rose thought about William, who had worked with federal survey offices and territorial land records throughout his career as a surveyor, who had told her once during the winter of their first year that the West was being quietly lost, and won not by gunslingers, but by paperwork. By who filed what and when and in which office, and whether anyone could prove it afterward. She thought about the sealed envelope at the bottom of her carpet bag under the spare dress, and the copy of her grandmother's Bible, and the small collection of William's personal survey records that she had not been able to bring herself to leave behind when the bank took everything else. The envelope William had written in the last weeks of his illness, when he knew what was coming and wanted to be certain she understood what to do if he was not there to do it himself. She had not opened it, not once in 6 months. She told herself this was because she was not ready. The truer answer was that opening it was the final acknowledgement that William had known, and that knowing had not stopped what came next, and she was not ready to sit with both of those things at once. She folded her hands around the warm ceramic of the coffee cup and set the thought aside. "Tell me more about the ranch," she said. The wagon arrived in front of Mrs. Hartwell's boarding house precisely when Ethan had said it would. 2 horses, a practical flatbed wagon with a bench seat, worn smooth from years of use, and beside Ethan on the bench, a younger man with dark blonde hair and the permanently amused expression of someone who has decided in advance that the day will be interesting. "So you're the cook," the younger man said before Rose had fully settled onto the bench. His voice carried the easy warmth of someone for whom conversation was never an effort. "Ethan said you had backbone. I could have told from across the street." "Cole," Ethan said, one word flat. Cole subsided, but he was still smiling. Rose looked from one man to the other and understood immediately the language they had developed across decades of brotherhood, compressed, efficient, loaded with meaning that required no elaboration between them. "Don't mind him," Ethan said, and for a moment she thought that might be all he offered on the subject. Then he added with the careful fairness of an older brother, "He's usually right about people. He's just occasionally insufferable about it." "Only occasionally," Cole said cheerfully. The 6 miles north on the mountain road gave the afternoon space to establish itself properly. The road climbed through stands of ponderosa pine that grew taller and closer together as the elevation increased, the bark red and deeply furrowed in the way of old trees, the air among them carrying the particular clean sharpness of high-altitude pine resin in cold water. To the east, visible in breaks between the trees, the valley spread out below them like a map someone had drawn with a generous hand. The grass turned gold and bronze with October the Creek, a silver thread catching the declining sun. And beyond all of it, filling the northern horizon with the authority of things that predate human concern, entirely the Bitterroot Mountains. White at the peaks, already blue-gray and shadow purple at dusk. Immense and indifferent, and in their indifference strangely clarifying. Rose had not looked at a landscape in 6 months. She had been looking at the next step, the next county, the next possibility. She looked now and felt something in her chest that had been clenched for a very long time loosened by a single, almost imperceptible degree. "First time in Montana?" Cole asked. "First time above 3,000 feet, she said. "It changes you," he said, without the performative profundity that sentence could have carried. "Just as a statement of fact, the way you'd tell someone that a particular tool worked better wet. The altitude, the distance, it takes away what isn't necessary and leaves the rest." He glanced at her sidelong. "Some people find that terrifying. Other people find out they needed exactly that." She did not answer, but she thought about it for the rest of the ride. Grant Stoneridge met the wagon at the ranch gate with the barely contained energy of a young man who has been waiting for longer than the polite amount of time and is not quite managing to conceal it. He was 26 with auburn hair and green eyes that were the only feature of his face not currently occupied by a grin of absolute sincerity. Is this her? Can she cook biscuits? Ethan said I shouldn't ask that first thing, but I've been thinking about it since noon. Grant? Ethan's same register as he had used with Cole. Right. Grant jumped forward and offered his hand to help Rose down from the wagon with the earnest good manners of a young man whose mother had insisted on them. Welcome to Stone Ridge Ranch, Mrs. Whitfield. I'm Grant the youngest, and therefore the most charming. Cole will tell you he's the most charming, but he's working from a false premise. Rose shook his hand. Then she smiled, which she had not done in 3 days, and it came out genuine because the alternative would have required suppressing something that Grant Stoneridge's particular variety of warmth made difficult to suppress. I'll take that under advisement, she said. The Stone Ridge compound resolved itself from distance into specificity as she walked through the gate, the main house built of squared pine logs with real glass in the windows, a luxury at this elevation in 1872, that spoke to Abel Stoneridge's particular ambitions for the life he had built here. The trading post storefront attached to the eastern side of the house, the sign above the door, painted in careful letters that had faded but not peeled. A large barn, a smaller barn, a smokehouse, a root cellar cut into the hillside, and what had once clearly been a kitchen garden behind the main house, now given over to frostbitten weeds and the remnants of autumn's thorough work on anything that had been green. The buildings were sound, the fences were maintained, the equipment visible in the yard was serviceable and carefully stored. Someone cared about the function of this place with a consistency that spoke of long habit and genuine investment. But there was something missing, and Rose felt it before she could have named it. Windows without curtains, no flowers anywhere, not even dried ones from the summer. The table visible through the main house window, bare wood, no cloth, no decoration of any kind. The trading post counter when they passed it, immaculate, well organized, entirely without any of the small touches that distinguished a place where people lived from a place where people merely operated. A home where the woman had been was now a place where men worked. The distinction was everywhere, and invisible like light that reveals what it illuminates only by its absence. Abel Stoneridge was on the porch. He was 62 years old, and the decades showed in him the way they show in certain kinds of wood, not as decay, but as depth, the grain of every season's work pressed into the surface and made permanent. He was lean and hard in the manner of men who have spent their lives at altitude and physical labor, and he carried himself with the particular straightness of someone who has never once considered that his presence in a room required justification. His eyes were amber, the same color as Ethan's, but older, with more behind them. He studied Rose with a look that was thorough and unhurried and entirely without cruelty. Mrs. Whitfield, he said, Ethan tells me you've had hard times. I'm willing to work Mr. Stoneridge, she replied. She met his eyes without wavering. That's all that matters now. He held her gaze for a long moment. Something moved across his face that was not quite warmth, but was the precursor to it, the way the air changes before the sun breaks through cloud cover. Then he nodded once with the finality of a man who has made a decision. Fair enough, he said. Supper's at 6 sharp. The men get powerfully cranky when they're kept waiting. He turned toward the door, then stopped. We're glad to have you, Mrs. Whitfield. This kitchen has been waiting for someone who knows what to do with it. He went inside. Rose looked at the porch for a moment. Then she picked up her carpet bag, straightened her back, and followed. The kitchen was larger than she expected, and in precisely the state that Mrs. Hartwell had predicted. The room itself was good bones, a cast-iron stove of substantial size, a proper water pump at the sink, workable counter space along 2 wall shelves that had once been organized and could be again, and a larder door that opened onto a room stocked with the serious winter provisions of a man who did not permit his household to run short on essentials. Flour, cornmeal, dried beans, salt pork, preserved goods in careful rows, root vegetables in the cellar beneath. Someone had done the provisioning with intelligence and care. No one had done anything else with care in some time. Dust on every surface. The remnants of the ranch hands' months of attempted cooking, scorched pot bottoms left to soak, and then abandoned a cast iron skillet with something burned so thoroughly into it that identification was no longer possible. A collection of tin cups rinsed but not properly washed, stacked in a manner that suggested urgency rather than intention. "I know it's a sight," Ethan said from the doorway. He had followed her in without being noticed, which was unusual for a man of his size. The boys tried their best, but "It's fine," Rose said. She was already rolling her sleeves to the elbow. "I'll need water heated for cleaning and someone to show me where everything is kept." He straightened slightly. Not much, but enough to notice. "I'll fetch water. Your room's through there." He indicated a door at the far end of the kitchen. "It's small, but it's private. Used to be the pantry before my mother had it converted." The room was indeed small. A narrow bed with a good quilt. A washstand with a clean basin. A single window looking out toward the smaller barn, through which the last of the October light was turning everything the color of old amber. Rose set her carpet bag on the bed, sat next to it for exactly the time it took to draw one deliberate breath, and then went back to face the kitchen. For the next hour, Ethan navigated it with her where the good pots were, how the stove's particular system of dampers worked, which shelves held what the idiosyncrasies of the water pump in cold weather. He was thorough and patient and offered information without editorializing it, the way competent people share knowledge when they respect the person they are teaching. Rose paid close attention. She cataloged the larder, assessed what could be done with it, and began mentally constructing the first meal. "8 hands plus your father and the 3 of you," she said, counting. "Sometimes more during roundup. Sometimes we also operate the trading post, so there are occasional travelers and suppliers." He was heating water at the stove, his movements in the kitchen familiar in the way of someone who did not spend much time here, but had been raised by a woman who insisted everyone understand its functions. "The men eat hearty, they work hard. What time do they rise?" "First light. They'll want coffee and breakfast by 5. She looked at the available pots, sorting by condition. "I'll manage." He set down the water bucket and looked at her directly. "About what I said in the store." She looked up. "When I said that gold wasn't what these mountains need, that you are." He had the manner of someone choosing words with the care they deserved. "I meant it practically not as flattery. This ranch runs on work and grit. We've all got reasons for being here. We've all got losses." He held her gaze steadily. "What matters is what a person does with today." Before she could respond, the kitchen door opened with the particular force of men who have been outside in cold air and are not thinking about the people who might be inside. They came in a loose group drawn by the smell of heated water and the remarkable novelty of a woman in the kitchen. 8 of them, ranging from Chet, who was 17 years old and tow-headed, and currently wearing the expression of someone who has just received unexpected good news, to Silas Vance, who was 55, and grizzled and carried himself with the quietness of a man who has survived everything the frontier has offered and has stopped being surprised by any of it. "Boys," Ethan said with a particular flatness that communicated a full paragraph in 3 letters. "This is Mrs. Whitfield. She runs this kitchen now. Mind your manners." They shuffled and muttered in the way of men who have been told to mind their manners and are making the effort. Hats came off. Eyes went to the stove and came back. Chet, who had clearly been composing his question since before he walked through the door, blurted it out before better judgment could intervene. "Ma'am, does this mean no more of Silas's beans?" "Hey now," said a large man with a thick mustache who was presumably Silas Vance, his voice carrying the wounded dignity of a man whose culinary reputation has just been publicly challenged. "Your beans could saddle a mule," another man said, and the laughter that followed was the relaxed kind, the kind that belonged to men who had been in close quarters long enough to know exactly where the edges of each other's humor were. "Enough!" Abel Stoneridge's voice came from the doorway, carrying the particular authority of a man who does not need to raise it. The kitchen went quiet. "Mrs. Whitfield has work to do. Clear out and let her do it. Supper at 6. They filed out, but Rose caught the expression on their faces as they went, And it was something she recognized from the boarding house dining rooms and church socials of her former life. Hope of the uncomplicated variety, the kind that asks nothing complicated, only whether there is going to be enough to eat and whether it will be worth eating. She turned back to the stove. There was work to do. She produced supper at 6 o'clock with 12 minutes to spare. Beans properly seasoned for the first time in 2 months, with salt pork and onions cooked down into them until they had actual flavor. Cornbread made in the large cast iron pan she had found behind three inadequate alternatives. Coffee brewed at a strength that justified the name. Nothing elaborate, nothing that required ingredients she had not found in a larder designed for practical winter use. But it was hot and plentiful, and it was food in the real sense of the word. The men filed in at 6 with an order that suggested the habit was already formed. They took established places at the long table. Abel at the head, Ethan to his right, Cole and Grant, filling out the family's portion of the table with the easy familiarity of men who have shared a table since childhood. The 8 hands arranged themselves with the efficiency of people who have negotiated seating over time. Rose served. She moved efficiently, filling plates and coffee cups, watching the table from the working distance of someone whose job is to feed people rather than participate in being fed. The first bites produced the silence that good food sometimes earns from hungry men, a brief suspension of conversation, while the fact of the meal is absorbed. Then Chet made a sound that he would later deny. "Ma'am," he said with the earnestness of someone reporting a genuine discovery, "this is actual food." Chet. Silas Vance with the firmness of a man who has been embarrassed by association enough times to have developed opinions on it. "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking," Chet said with the moral confidence of the 17-year-old, and the looks that traveled around the table confirmed he was not wrong. Abel Stoneridge, who had eaten in silence with the attention of a man giving a matter its proper consideration, looked up at Rose as she refilled his coffee. "That was a fine meal, Mrs. Whitfield. First real one we've had in a good while." Coming from him, it was less a compliment than a verdict, and she understood that he meant it exactly as much as a verdict meant. The other men murmured agreement in the various registers of men who are grateful and do not quite know how to say it, and she caught Ethan watching her from his place at the table with something in his expression that she could not immediately name. Later, after the table was cleared and the hands had gone back to the bunkhouse, Rose stood at the sink working through the dishes with the particular satisfaction of a task completed against odds. The kitchen was already different from what she had found 3 hours ago, not transformed but on its way. Things in their right places, surfaces cleaned, the stove banked for the morning. Small changes that added up to the beginning of order. Ethan appeared at her elbow with a dish towel. She had not heard him come in. "You don't have to," she began. "My mother made everyone help with cleanup," he said. "No reason to change that." He took a dripping plate from the rack and dried it with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who had done this many times and saw no cause for comment on the fact. "The men are already talking about breakfast." Chet offered to come in early to help with the fire if it meant proper biscuits. "I'll manage the fire myself," she said, "but tell him I appreciate the offer." A pause. The kitchen was quiet except for the water and the sound of the stove settling as it cooled. "You did well tonight," Ethan said without looking at her. "I knew you would. You knew nothing about me except that I was desperate enough to try trading my wedding ring for bread." He set down the dried plate. He looked at her, then with a directness that she was beginning to understand was simply how he occupied the world. "I knew you still had pride in the way you stood. I knew you looked at that ring like it meant something more than gold. I knew you didn't beg even when begging might have worked." He was quiet for a moment. People show who they are in hard moments. What I saw in that store was someone who'd bend before they'd break. Out here, that's the kind of person a place like this needs. She turned back to the dishes. Something had happened to the back of her throat, and she needed a moment before she trusted her voice. "Fine words, Mr. Stoneridge," she said, "but I'm just a cook now. Nothing more complicated than that." "Nothing wrong with honest work," he said. And then, "Please, just Ethan. Mr. Stoneridge is my father." They finished the dishes in the companionable quiet of two people who did not know each other well enough for easy conversation, but did not feel the need to manufacture it. When the last cup was dried and set in its place, Rose turned to find Ethan holding something he had taken from his coat pocket, a small bunch of wildflowers already beginning to dry the pale gold and deep blue of late-season mountain blooms, pressed together in a loose bundle. "Found these on the road back from town," he said, and there was something in his voice that did not usually live there, something younger and less certain. "Thought your room might." He stopped, started again. "Ma always liked flowers in the house." Rose took the flowers carefully. She looked at them for a long moment. Then she looked at him. This quiet man who had offered work instead of pity, dignity instead of charity, and was now standing in the kitchen he had navigated with her for an hour, holding wildflowers with the expression of someone who is not entirely sure he has done the right thing. "Thank you, Ethan," she said. He nodded, turned to go. Then he stopped at the door with his back to her and said something that she would think about for a long time afterward. "What you said about being just a cook, you're wrong about that." He did not turn around. "You came here with nothing and you fed 12 people and you're already thinking about what needs doing tomorrow. That's not nothing. That's not even close to nothing." He opened the door. "Good night, Mrs. Whitfield." The door closed behind him. The trouble arrived before the night was fully over. Rose had settled into her small room, found a jar for the wildflowers, placed them on the windowsill, where the last gray light of evening still touched them. She had unpacked what little she had arranged the few objects of her former life on the washstand, in the order that felt right, the small Bible that had belonged to her grandmother, the leather-bound notebook where William had kept his personal records, and the carpet bag itself tucked under the narrow bed with its contents that she had not yet examined. She was sitting on the edge of the bed with the gold ring in her palm, not wearing it, not putting it away, just holding it in the lamplight and thinking about William, about the particular quality of silence that follows someone who has been important to you and is no longer there to fill it, when she heard voices from the trading post entrance. Not the voices of men returning to the bunkhouse. The timbre of newcomers, of introduction, of the negotiation that happens when strangers arrive after dark asking for something. She went to her window. The angle did not allow a direct view, but she could see the lamplight from the trading post spilling out across the yard, and in it 2 horses she did not recognize, and the silhouettes of 3 men. 2 were talking. The third, a little distance back, held the horses and said nothing at all. She watched for a moment. Something registered in the quality of her attention, the particular alertness that 6 months of navigating the frontier alone had developed in her. These were not men in need of shelter from weather or supplies for a journey. The 2 who were talking had the stillness of people who are not cold despite the temperature, people whose attention is not on finding a meal or a bed, but on something that requires observation rather than comfort. She could not have explained what gave her this impression, but she had learned in the months since William died to trust the impressions that arrive without explanation. She stepped back from the window. She set the ring on the washstand. She lay down on the narrow bed, fully dressed except for her boots, and listened to the voices below resolve into decisions she could not hear, and then into the sounds of men heading toward the bunkhouse. In the morning she would learn their names. Dutch and Reeves, looking for winter work, taken on by Ethan because the ranch was short-handed before the brutal Montana winter locked the high country into itself for months. A third man introduced as a companion of the other 2, who had ridden in separately and left again before anyone had properly accounted for his presence. She would smile at Dutch at the breakfast table the next morning. She would note the way he smiled back, easy and quick, with his eyes going not to her face, but to the kitchen itself, the shelves, the window above the sink that looked out toward the trading post office door. She would note that Reeves sat with the particular tension of a man who has something to feel guilty about and has not yet decided what to do about it. She would note all of this, and she would tuck it away in the part of her mind where her father's practical training and William's surveyor's precision and 6 months of frontier survival had built something that she was only beginning to understand was an instinct. That night, however, in the first private dark she had inhabited in weeks, she held the ring and thought about William. about the inventory records he kept in duplicate, about the surveying work in Montana Territory, the summer of 1869, the valley he had described in one of his letters as the most beautiful piece of country he had ever been asked to document, about the sealed envelope at the bottom of the carpet bag under the bed, the one he had written when he knew what was coming and wanted to be certain, absolutely certain, that nothing he had recorded would be lost. She thought about the way Ethan Stoneridge had said, "We don't trade away our memories. We just learn to carry them different." She thought about Abel Stoneridge standing on his porch in the October light, the man who had built this place from nothing and was fighting to keep it from someone who wanted to take it with the slow machinery of territorial courts and money and time. She thought about Clearwater Creek. She thought about the sealed envelope. She was not ready to open it. She was still not ready, but she was aware, lying in the narrow bed in the converted pantry of Stoneridge Trading Post, with the sound of the mountain wind picking up outside and the first stars appearing in the enormous Montana sky, that the envelope existed. That William had put something in it for exactly this kind of contingency, that she had been carrying it across 3 states for 6 months without knowing why. She slipped the ring into her pocket, not trading it, not losing it, resting it for the night. She closed her eyes. Outside, the Bitterroot Mountains stood over the valley with the patience of things that have watched 1,000 seasons change and expect to watch 1,000 more. The creek ran in the dark, cold and clear, over stones it had been running over since before any human being had a word for this place. The stars came out in the particular abundance that only exists at high altitude, where the atmosphere is thin enough to let the full weight of the universe show itself. In the morning, there would be a fire to start at 4 bread, to begin at 1/2 coffee to brew before 5. There would be 12 people depending on her to do those things well. There would be a kitchen to continue claiming as her own, a family to begin learning, a mountain to begin understanding. There would be a sealed envelope at the bottom of a carpet bag that she was not yet ready to open, and a man named Dutch who smiled with his eyes fixed on the wrong things, and a water rights dispute that had been running through territorial courts for 3 years, and a ranch that an honest man had built over 30 years and was trying to keep. There would be all of it waiting for morning. For the first time in 6 months, Rose Whitfield slept without dreaming of Ohio. 3 weeks into her time at Stoneridge, Rose Whitfield began to notice that the woman she had been was becoming harder to locate. This was not a dramatic transformation. It did not announce itself. It arrived the way altitude changes arrive, gradually in the body, before the mind, in small adjustments of capacity and perception that accumulate into something new before the person undergoing them has properly registered the process. She rose at 4 without the reluctant negotiation with consciousness that had characterized every morning for 6 months. Her hands, which had trembled through the last weeks of her journey with the fine tremor of genuine malnutrition, were steady. The hollow quality had left her face. The boots she had finally replaced with a serviceable pair from the Trading Post supply stock no longer let in the cold. She was learning the ranch the way she had learned William's surveying work in their 18 months of marriage, not as a student absorbing assigned lessons, but as a competent person paying close attention to a system that rewarded understanding. She knew which floorboards announced themselves at night. She knew how the stove behaved in an east wind compared to a west one, and that the damper required a different adjustment in temperatures below 20 degrees. She knew that Silas Vance took his coffee black and scalding, and that Chet, who was 17 and pretending not to be secretly preferred enough sugar in his to embarrass himself, and that the ratio required adjusting weekly as winter deepened and the work grew harder. She had begun reclaiming the kitchen garden. The ground was not yet frozen solid at the edges, and what Agnes Stoneridge had built there, over 30 years of determined planning, was not destroyed but dormant, the good bone structure of a serious gardener's work still visible beneath the season's neglect. Rose worked at it in the hour between the midday meal and the preparation for supper, pulling frost-killed weeds and turning soil where she could, and making a careful inventory of what had been planted where and what might survive and what would need to begin again from seed in spring. Cole brought her wildflowers twice that first week, appearing in the kitchen doorway with the easy, good humor of a man who has decided a thing is worth doing and sees no reason to make it complicated. He did not explain the gesture, and she did not ask him to, understanding instinctively that Cole Stoneridge expressed most of what mattered to him sideways through action rather than declaration, and that this suited him better than the alternative. Grant helped her carry water from the pump to the kitchen without being asked, and developed a habit of stopping in the kitchen doorway on his way in from morning chores to watch the bread rising with an expression of genuine philosophical wonder. He was the one closest to Agnes's kitchen as she gradually understood the youngest underfoot more than his brothers in childhood, curious about the domestic processes that Ethan and Cole had moved past as quickly as possible on their way to the work of men. He would not say this directly, but when she asked him once where Agnes kept her dried herbs, he answered without hesitation, going to exactly the right shelf without looking. Ethan watched all of this from the position of a man who was paying close attention and not advertising it. Cole noticed. Cole noticed most things and filed them with the equanimity of a man who has long accepted that his role in the family ecosystem is to see what Ethan will not see about himself and wait patiently for the appropriate moment. He watches you the way he watches weather coming over the peaks, Cole said one afternoon when they were alone in the trading post organizing the winter supply inventory, and Ethan was visible through the window, crossing the yard toward the barn. Like he's trying to get the angle right before he commits to a read. He's evaluating his new employee, Rose said without looking up from the ledger. He evaluated his new employee in the first 10 seconds at Briggs's store, Cole said pleasantly. What he's doing now is something else. He moved a stack of cured hides to a different shelf. I'm not trying to alarm you. I'm just telling you what I see because Ethan won't tell you himself until he's thought about it for approximately 6 months longer than necessary. Rose did not answer. She added a column of figures and wrote the total in the margin. Outside the window, Ethan disappeared into the barn. She had not yet opened William's envelope. She thought about it most nights before sleep, aware of its presence at the bottom of the carpet bag, with a particular awareness of something that is waiting for the right moment to be reckoned with. She was not ready. She thought she was getting closer to ready. These were not the same thing, and she was honest enough with herself not to pretend they were. The morning that changed everything arrived on a Tuesday, the third week of October, in the middle of a ledger session with Abel Stoneridge. Abel had taken to asking her to sit with the trading post accounts 2 mornings a week when the supply riders came through from Clearwater Ridge in Missoula. He had observed without comment the accuracy and speed with which she managed the kitchen inventory, and had concluded from this observation that she might be useful with the broader accounts. He was correct. She had kept William's books through the better part of their marriage, and the clarity of numerical reasoning was a thing she had always found genuinely satisfying in a world that was often neither clear nor reasonable. They worked in companionable silence on that Tuesday morning, Abel, with his reading glasses that he wore without acknowledgement of their necessity, and Rose with the supply manifest for the previous month. The fire in the trading post stove made the room warm, despite the October chill pressing against the windows. You said your husband was a surveyor, Abel said without looking up from the ledger. His voice had the quality of someone continuing a line of thought rather than initiating one. Yes, Rose said carefully. William Whitfield. Federal survey work, mostly. Based out of Columbus. Abel set down his pen. He looked at the ledger for a moment longer, then looked up at her with the eyes of a man who has just connected 2 things that had been sitting separate in his mind. Ohio Whitfield, he said. William Whitfield, who worked the Montana Territory Survey. Summer of 1869. The room was very quiet. Yes, she said. That's him. Abel Stoneridge did not move for a moment. He looked at the window at the valley visible through it, at the line of Clearwater Creek, catching the morning light at the eastern edge of the property. When he turned back to her, his face held something complicated gravity and the careful management of feeling that very self-contained men develop when they have been surprised by something they cannot afford to mishandle. I knew your husband, Mrs. Whitfield. Not well. He came through in the summer of '69 doing the federal survey of this drainage. He was at our dinner table one evening. Agnes fed him a proper meal, sent him on the next morning with provisions and a map she'd drawn of the mountain trails. He paused. Good man, careful eyes. He asked the right questions about the land and listened when I answered them. Another pause longer. I didn't connect the name when Ethan brought you in. I should have. Rose found that she needed a moment before she could speak, and she took it without apology. He wrote about this valley, she said finally, in a letter to me the summer he did the survey. He said it was the most beautiful piece of country he'd ever been asked to document, that the water was clean and the land was honest, and the man who'd claimed it had done so in good faith and built something worth building. Abel looked at the window again. He documented it thoroughly, he said. That was his quality. Thorough. He always kept personal copies of everything he filed, Rose said. 2 copies of every document, one for the federal office, one for his personal records. He said once that the West was going to be won or lost in the paperwork, and he wanted to be certain that what he recorded would survive. She paused. I have his personal records. I've been carrying them since Columbus. The silence in the trading post had weight to it. All of his Montana survey records, Abel said. Everything from that summer. Abel Stoneridge placed both hands flat on the desk and looked at them for a moment. Then he said, I need to speak with my sons before we go further with this. Tonight after supper. He looked at her directly. Don't mention this conversation to anyone else today, not anyone. She understood what he meant. She nodded and went back to the supply manifest and did not let herself think too carefully about what she was beginning to understand until she was alone in her kitchen with the door closed and the stove banked and the day's work waiting. Cole found her that evening after supper, after the hands had gone to the bunkhouse, and Abel and Ethan and Grant had retreated to the trading post office for the conversation she had not been part of. He came into the kitchen and closed the door behind him and sat down at the table with the manner of a man who has decided to say something difficult and is approaching it directly rather than at an angle. She poured him coffee without being asked. She poured herself one and sat across from him. I've been in contact with a federal lawyer in Helena for 8 months, he said. His name is Harrison Wells. He was a circuit judge before he retired and took up private practice. He's one of the only men in this territory that Victor Crane hasn't managed to buy or frighten. And believe me, Crane has tried both. Cole wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. Wells told me the only way to beat Crane in court is to take the case federal. The territorial court has been compromised. The presiding judge has a son working for Crane Timber. He looked at her steadily. To take it federal, we need federal documentation of our original land and water claim. Something recorded by the federal government, not by us, not by anyone local. Something that can't be dismissed as self-serving. Like a federal survey, Rose said. Like a federal survey, he agreed, completed in 1869 by a licensed federal surveyor filed in the proper offices. He held her gaze. Pa told Ethan and Grant tonight what you told him this morning, about your husband's records. He paused. If those records are what Pa thinks they are, Mrs. Whitfield, then you didn't just come here to cook. You came here carrying the thing we've been trying to find for 3 years. Rose sat with that for a moment. She thought about William in the summer of 1869, 28 years old and serious about his work in the way that precise people are serious, measuring this valley and recording what he measured with a thoroughness that was his fundamental quality. She thought about him sitting at Abel Stoneridge's dinner table and asking the right questions and listening to the answers. She thought about the sealed envelope at the bottom of her carpet bag written in the last months of his life, addressed to the federal land office in Helena. She thought about 11 cents in a hole in a boot and a ring pushed across a counter in Briggs's general store. I have to open an envelope, she said. Cole looked at her with the particular gentleness of a man who has understood something she has not yet said. When you're ready, he said. I've been carrying it for 6 months, she said. I think I've been ready longer than I knew. She did not open it that night. What happened instead interrupted everything, with the particular authority of the physical world asserting itself over human plans. 2 days after her conversation with Cole in the last thin warmth of an October afternoon, the Green Colt decided he had endured enough of Ethan's patient instruction for one session and expressed this opinion decisively. Rose was at the kitchen window when it happened, the Colt going sideways, then vertical, then the controlled chaos of a thrown rider and a horse making use of its freedom, and Ethan on the ground in the corral dust, in a posture that told her everything she needed to know before Grant's shout had finished crossing the yard. She ran. The shoulder was dislocated. She saw it before she reached him in the unnatural angle of his left arm, in the rigid way he was holding his entire body against the consequence of moving it. His face in the October light was the color of old bone. Cole was beside him, maintaining a calm that cost him something. The 8 ranch hands stood in the configuration of men who want urgently to help and have run out of ways to do it. Rose had watched her father in the years when he was still the man she had known him to be, reduce dislocated shoulders in the examination room of his Dayton practice. She had watched it done correctly, and she had watched it done incorrectly, and she understood the difference. She had never done it herself. She knelt in the dirt of the corral behind Ethan without ceremony. "It needs setting," she said. "It will hurt." He looked at her. His eyes, which were usually so careful about what they permitted to show, were wide open with pain at the moment, and what she found in them behind the pain was not what she expected. It was not fear. It was not resistance. It was trust, absolute and immediate, of the kind that arrives without deliberation, because there is no time for deliberation, and the person in front of you has already given you the necessary information. "Do it," he said. She sent Chet for whiskey and clean cloth. She positioned herself with the precision her father had insisted on, finding the landmarks on Ethan's shoulder by feel, verifying the angle. She drew one breath and held it. "Count to 3, she said. Then on 2, because the body flinches at 3, regardless of what the mind intends. She pulled and rotated in one smooth, committed motion. The joint relocated with a sound that sent half the ranch hands looking at the fence line. Ethan's entire body went rigid for a single second. A sound escaped him that he would not have permitted under any other circumstance. Then his body released as the pain of dislocation gave way to the manageable pain of a joint that is where it belongs. Silas Vance breathed out through his teeth. Chet looked at Rose with an expression he would also deny later. Ethan's right hand found hers as she began fashioning the sling. The grip was brief, controlled, not the grip of a man in crisis, but of a man communicating something he did not have language for at the moment. She felt it travel from her fingers to somewhere considerably further in than her fingers, and she let herself acknowledge this for exactly the duration of the moment, and then she returned to the practical work of the sling. "This needs to stay immobile for several days," she said, tying the last knot. "Grant, help him to the house." "I can walk," Ethan said. "I know," she said. "Walk, then." He walked. Of course he did. She brought supper to his room that evening, which was the first time she had been further into the house than the kitchen and her own small room. What the room told her about its occupant, she read the way she read everything, carefully and without drawing conclusions she hadn't earned. A narrow bed made with military neatness, a washstand, a shelf of books whose spine showed honest use. Cooper Dickens' A Surveying Manual with a Broken Spine. Emerson's essays opened so often the cover was soft. Under the window, a pair of worn leather work gloves placed with the precision of a man who respects his tools. On the wall, a small pencil sketch of a woman who could only be Agnes Stoneridge, with Grant's eyes and the suggestion of a smile that did not require the mouth to be smiling to be present. She cut the food on his plate into manageable pieces before he could object. He objected anyway. "I'm not an invalid." "No," she agreed. "You're a stubborn man who will re-injure that shoulder trying to prove something that no one in this house doubts. There. Now you can feed yourself and maintain your dignity simultaneously." His laugh was the kind that had not been used enough recently. "You sound like Ma." She sounds like she was a sensible woman. She was, among other things. The warmth in his voice was carrying something underneath it, grief kept at a functional distance by practice rather than resolution. He looked at the sketch on the wall. She would have had opinions about you. Good ones or bad ones? Good ones. He said it without hesitation. She liked people who got on with things. She had no patience for what she called the performance of difficulty. If something needed doing, you did it, and you didn't make a production of having done it. He shifted slightly, testing the shoulder's new limitations. She taught all three of us to cook because she said a man who couldn't feed himself was only half prepared for life. Grant took to it best. He used to follow her around the kitchen asking questions about why things worked the way they did. Something crossed his face briefly. Ethan and Cole were too impatient to be good students, but we all learned enough. Tell me more about her, Rose said, and settled into the chair beside his bed, because there was nowhere else she needed to be and no good reason to pretend otherwise. So he did. In the diminishing afternoon light with the stove sending its warmth through the floorboards and the sound of the ranch settling into evening. Outside, Ethan Stoneridge told her about Agnes Harper Stoneridge, the school teacher from Pennsylvania who came west with a trunk of books and a conviction that civilization was a thing you built on purpose rather than a thing that arrived on its own. Who insisted on flowers on the table through every season, making do with dried ones in winter when the mountain offered nothing fresh. Who made Abel learn the poems she loved, reading them to him in the evenings until he could recite them himself, which he could still do, though he would deny it in any company larger than immediate family. Who planted roses in the mountain garden against all reasonable expectation of success and kept them alive through 30 Montana winters through what she described as stubbornness and what everyone else recognized as genuine communion with growing things. She would have told you the roses need attention by now, he said. She'd have been out in the garden the day after she arrived, whatever the season. I've been looking at them, Rose said. The bones are still good. It will take time, but they can come back. He looked at her. In the lamplight, his eyes were very amber, very still. She would have liked hearing that. Silence held between them for a moment that was not uncomfortable. She was aware of it, aware of him, aware of the careful distance between the chair and the bed, and what that distance represented in 1872 Montana territory, and why it was correct, and also why it was in some way she could not have articulated precisely insufficient. You're looking at me, he said quietly. Heat moved up her face. I was thinking you need a haircut. The corner of his mouth moved. Is that what you were thinking? I can't have the man running this establishment looking like he's lost an argument with a pine tree. Heaven forbid. The amusement was genuine, warmer than anything she had seen from him yet. Then his voice shifted, becoming careful in the way of a man approaching something important from the correct direction. Rose, he paused, tried again. Mrs. Whitfield, your husband, do you miss him? The question settled between them with the weight of something that mattered. She considered it honestly the way it deserved. I miss who we were together, she said. The life we'd built, the future we'd planned, the man he was. She looked at her hands in her lap. But the sharpest edge of it is fading, and sometimes I feel guilty about that. My mother used to say grief was like mountain snow, he said. Covers everything at first, but then spring comes and things grow in the melt that couldn't grow before. It doesn't mean what was under the snow didn't matter, just means life keeps on. She looked at him in the lamplight and thought with the clarity that sometimes arrived unexpectedly, this man is nothing like William. William had been quiet in the way of still water, his depths visible to anyone who looked with patience. Ethan was quiet in the way of deep rock, his depths present, but requiring a different kind of looking altogether. Nothing like William. And this was not, she realized, a criticism of either of them. His right hand moved toward hers on the armrest, stopped a careful distance short. Rose, he began. Mrs. Whitfield. Chet's voice from the bottom of the stairs, carrying the particular urgency of a 17-year-old who does not know he is interrupting anything. Silas says to ask about the leftover cornbread, and Dutch is wanting to know. I'll be right down, she called, and stood quickly with the gratitude of someone whose retreat has been provided for them. You should rest. I'll send Chet up with anything else you need. She did not look at Ethan's face as she left, But she felt his eyes on her back until she reached the doorway, and she carried the warmth of that attention down the stairs and into the kitchen and pressed her palms against the cool wood of the work table and told herself firmly that she was the cook and nothing more, and that this was a perfectly satisfactory thing to be. She did not entirely believe it, but she was working on it. The Harvest Festival in Clearwater Ridge happened on the first Saturday of November, and Abel Stoneridge announced at breakfast 3 days prior that Stoneridge Ranch would attend for the first time in 2 years. He said this in the same tone he used to announce that the south fence needed attention, as a statement of decided fact that was not open to renegotiation. He said that Ethan would escort Mrs. Whitfield. Ethan's ears reddened by approximately 4 degrees. He nodded. Cole's grin achieved a width that should not have been anatomically possible. Grant made a sound that no one of good standing would have been proud to produce, and Silas Vance, who had been listening from the far end of the table, looked into his coffee cup with the expression of a man who is keeping his opinions to himself because he values his employment. Earlier that week, Ethan had quietly put aside the sling. His shoulder no longer needed flexing his left hand at the breakfast table, with the careful satisfaction of a man confirming that a thing is healed correctly. He had not made a point of it. The shoulder was healed. That was sufficient. The dress came from Abel, presented the evening before the festival, with the awkward solemnity of a man doing something that matters and not knowing the protocol for it. A deep blue cotton printed with small flowers taken from a trunk where it had been folded since Agnes's death. He carried it to Rose in the kitchen doorway with both hands as one carries something fragile. "This was Agnes's," he said. "She'd want it worn." Rose took it carefully. She thought about wearing a dead woman's dress to spend an afternoon beside that woman's son, and she waited for this to feel wrong, and it didn't. It felt like being told something. "Thank you, Mr. Stoneridge," she said. He turned to go, then stopped. "She would have found reasons to like you," he said, which from Abel Stoneridge was the equivalent of a prepared speech. "She was particular about people, didn't suffer fools and didn't pretend to. But she admired grit." He paused. "She would have found reasons." He went back to the trading post. Rose stood in the kitchen doorway holding the blue dress and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Something that was not happiness exactly, but was in its neighborhood. When she came out of her room the next morning wearing the dress with her hair properly pinned for the first time since Columbus and the small cameo at her throat that had been her mother's, Ethan was waiting by the wagon in the yard. He turned at her approach. He went entirely still for a moment, not in the way of someone processing unexpected information, in the way of someone whose body has made a decision before the mind has caught up to it. "You look," he said and stopped. Started again. "You look beautiful." "Your mother had lovely taste," she said, because she needed to say something that was true and not dangerous. "She always said pretty things should be worn," he said quietly, "not kept in trunks." He helped her up to the wagon seat with careful hands, and they drove down the mountain road toward Clearwater Ridge in the crystalline November morning. The town had transformed itself for the occasion with the genuine festivity of a community that works hard enough year-round to understand what celebration costs and therefore means. Lanterns hung from every available surface. Tables in the square held the contributions of every kitchen in the county. The cleared area beside the church had been designated the dance floor, and the fiddle player was already warming up with the authority of a man who has been the primary entertainment at every social event in this valley for 15 years and knows it. Rose navigated the whispered commentary with her chin level. She heard it the widow from Ohio, Stoneridge's cook. "Did you see how Ethan looks at her?" She heard the skepticism, and she heard the approval, and she heard Mrs. Hartwell arriving at her elbow with the protective momentum of a small freight train. "Don't mind the busybodies," Mrs. Hartwell said. "Half of them would trade places with you in a heartbeat. The other half are just curious. This county hasn't had anything genuinely worth watching in 2 years." The afternoon passed the roping contest in which Cole placed first with the easy confidence of natural ability. Ethan's second and Grant became memorably entangled in his own rope. the pie judging from which Rose emerged with her diplomacy intact. Introductions to what felt like the entire population of a three-county area, each of whom seemed to have a story about the Stone Ridges that they considered it their civic duty to share. When the dancing began as the light shifted toward evening and the lanterns took over their work from the sun, Ethan found her at the edge of the dance floor. He was holding his hat in both hands with the slight stiffness of a man who is about to do something that requires courage in a different register than the kind he generally calls on. "May I have this dance?" he said. She placed her hand in his. He was not a natural dancer. He was precise and attentive, and he had been raised by a woman who insisted that men who could not dance were only half civilized, and so he had been made to learn enough to avoid embarrassing anyone. His hand was steady at her waist, his left arm moving freely and without pain now that the joint had healed clean. He maintained the proper distance. None of this prevented her from being aware of him in a way that had nothing to do with propriety and everything to do with the fact that for the first time since William had died, another person's warmth and solidity felt like something she wanted to move toward rather than past. They moved through the opening bars of a slow waltz in silence. Then he said with the careful pace of someone who has been composing a sentence for longer than the conversation that produced it, "I need to tell you something." She waited. "I was engaged before." The words came out even deliberate, carrying their cost without complaint. Her name was Catherine Aldrich. Her father ran a ranch in the Flathead Valley. She was educated and accomplished and everything a man could want by the general accounting. His jaw tightened. "She came to Stone Ridge to meet my family, spent a week. On the last evening she told me she couldn't do it, couldn't bury herself in the mountains for any man. Said she'd rather have a comfortable life than a true one." He held Rose steady through a turn his right hand firm. She left the next morning. Rose felt the words settle and understood what they had cost him. Not just the engagement lost, but the particular variety of trust that a private man extends once and then does not quickly extend again. "I'm telling you this," he said, "because I need you to understand that what I feel for you is not loneliness or convenience or the simple fact of a woman in a house that has been missing one. When you argue with me, which you do regularly and which I am not accustomed to." A faint pause. "When you stand in that kitchen and you're already thinking 3 meals ahead. When you looked at those wildflowers I left on your windowsill and you found a jar for them instead of putting them in a drawer." He stopped moving. Around them, other couples continued their waltz. "You are not surviving this life, you are meeting it. You are making it better. You are—" He stopped, found a simpler truth. "You are making me better." They were still. The music played around them. She reached up and touched his cheek. The rough jaw, the wind-weathered skin, the face of a man who had been shaped by the same mountains that were shaping her. Her hand did not tremble. "I'm not Catherine," she said. "No," he said, covering her hand with his. "You are Rose, and that is everything." They're starting the next dance. Cole materialized beside them with the supernatural timing of a younger brother who has been watching and waiting for exactly the right moment to be simultaneously useful and insufferable. "If you two are finished looking at each other." Ethan's face went red. Rose laughed and it came out fully and free, and she saw something shift in Ethan's expression when he heard it, something that had been waiting for that particular sound for longer than he would have admitted. The evening wound down with the warmth of a community that has spent a day in each other's company and is reluctant to let it go. Rose packed the leftover pies with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose contribution to the communal table has been well received and was beginning to think about the ride home when she heard Dutch's voice rise at the edge of the square. The altercation was already half over by the time she located it. Dutch and Reeves squared against two men she recognized as being from Crane's operation, the kind of confrontation that whiskey and proximity manufacture out of ingredients that had been waiting to combine. Ethan moved through the crowd with the quiet authority of a man parting water, stepped between the groups, and said something in a voice too low for her to hear from where she stood. Dutch backed down, But the look he gave Ethan before he turned away was the look of a man who has been required to postpone something, not abandon it. Rose watched Dutch's face in the lamplight and felt the thing she had felt on the first night, the calibration of her instincts toward wrongness in a register she could not precisely name. His eyes, when they moved to her across the square for just a moment, held the measuring quality she had noticed from the first evening. Not threatening, appraising. The look of a man calculating the value of what he's looking at. On the wagon ride home through the November dark, Ethan's hand found hers on the bench between them. She did not move hers away, and they rode the rest of the mountain road like that in the silence of two people who have said enough for one day. At the trading post door, he kissed her gentle and careful, the question in it more present than the statement, and she answered the question by leaning into him rather than away. When they parted, both breathing slightly unevenly, he rested his forehead against hers. "I'll court you properly," he said, "whatever time you need." "Just be yourself," she said. "That's all I need." 3 days after the festival, with the first serious snow threatening on the northern ridge, Rose opened the sealed envelope. She did it in the kitchen in the early hours before anyone else was awake, sitting at the work table with the lamp turned up and a cup of coffee she had not touched. She had carried the envelope down from her room in both hands, the way Abel had carried Agnes's dress, understanding that some objects require that kind of handling. William's handwriting on the outside, careful, precise, the penmanship of a man who understood that a document's legibility was part of its usefulness. The date, September 1871, 6 weeks before his death. She broke the wax seal. The letter was 4 pages. She read it twice slowly in the lamplight, while the stove ticked and the mountain held its breath outside the window. What William had written was this: in the summer of 1869, conducting the federal survey of the Clearwater Creek drainage in Montana Territory, he had documented the water origin flow patterns and watershed of the creek with the thoroughness that federal survey work required. He had filed the complete record with the Federal Territorial Survey Office in Helena and with the Federal Land Archive in Columbus as a standard backup procedure. He enclosed in the envelope a certified summary of his principal findings: the creek's origin above the Stone Ridge homestead, the original homestead claim filed by Abel Stoneridge in 1852, establishing prior rights to the water by 17 years over any subsequent claim. The summary was signed in his hand, notarized by the Ohio Land Office, and certified as an accurate representation of the federal record on file in 2 separate federal offices. He had written at the end of the letter, "I do not know why you are reading this, rather than me delivering it to the proper authority myself. I hope the reason is a minor one. But if it is not, then what I want you to know is that the work was done correctly and the record exists. Somewhere in the country there is documentation of the truth of what I found, and if it is ever needed, it will be there. That is the best thing a surveyor can offer, not gold, not land, but the honest record of what is. Keep this safe. It may matter to someone someday in ways neither of us can predict." Rose sat with the letter for a long time after she finished reading it. She thought about William spending an evening at Abel Stoneridge's dinner table in 1869, asking the right questions and listening to the answers, and then going out the next morning to measure and record and document what he found with the care of a man who believed that accuracy was not just professional obligation, but a kind of moral responsibility. She thought about him writing this letter 3 years later, dying in a hospital ward, making sure that what he had recorded would survive him. She thought about her own 6 months of carrying this across Ohio and Iowa and Nebraska and Montana without knowing what she was carrying. She thought about Cole's 8 months of correspondence with Harrison Wells in Helena, about the case that had stalled for 3 years in a territorial court that had been made unreliable by Crane's money, about the water rights to Clearwater Creek that Abel Stoneridge had been fighting to keep with one hand tied behind his back because he had no federal documentation, only his word and his 20-year presence in this valley. She thought William measured this valley. He recorded what he found. The record has been sitting in federal offices in Helena and Columbus for 3 years, waiting for someone to know it was there. She brought the letter and the certified summary to Abel's office before breakfast. She laid the documents on his desk and stood back while he read them. She watched his face move through the sequence of a man encountering something he has been looking for: initial recognition, careful verification, the long pause of someone who does not permit himself to react to good news until he has confirmed it is actual. He read both documents twice. He held the notarized summary up to the window light as though the additional illumination would help him verify what he was reading. Then he set it down. He sat for a long moment with his hands flat on the desk and said nothing. "This is it," he said finally. His voice was level, carrying its feeling the way he carried everything deep and controlled and present. "3 years we've been trying to prove what your husband recorded in a summer's work." He looked at the window at the creek visible in the distance, catching the November light. He was a good man. "He was," she said. Cole was at the table when they came out to breakfast, and one look at Rose's face told him something had shifted. She watched him read it, saw the question arrive in his eyes, and gave him the smallest nod. He exhaled through his nose a breath that carried 3 years of correspondence with Harrison Wells and 8 months of careful patience, and picked up his coffee cup. "I'll need to ride to Helena," he said quietly to no one in particular. "After breakfast," Abel said. What none of them knew, because none of them had reason to watch the kitchen window from outside in the early morning dark, was that Dutch had been there. He had risen before the household, a habit he had not explained, and had been crossing the yard toward the barn on some errand when he saw the lamp in the kitchen window. He had stopped. He had approached. He had stood in the shadow of the wall beside the window for long enough to see Rose reading the documents at the table, long enough to see what they were, long enough to understand what they meant. He had gone to the barn. He had saddled his horse. He had ridden quietly out of the Stone Ridge compound before anyone was awake enough to notice, taking the south road toward the Crane timber operation. Reeves, waking in the bunkhouse to find Dutch's bunk empty, stared at the ceiling for a long while. He turned his head and looked at the pair of work gloves on the nail beside his bunk, the ones Abel Stoneridge had pressed into his hands 3 weeks ago on a morning when the temperature had dropped without warning and his hands were cracking from the cold. A small thing, the kind of thing most men would not notice about a hired hand they did not know well. Reeves got up. He did not follow Dutch south. He sat on the edge of his bunk in the pre-dawn cold and turned the gloves over in his hands and tried to work out what kind of man he intended to be for the rest of the time he had left to be anything. Rose, returning to the kitchen after breakfast to begin the day's preparations, did not yet notice that the carpet bag under her bed had been moved. She would not notice until mid-morning when she went to retrieve the original documents for Cole to take to Helena. The bag was there. The original documents were gone. The certified summary, which she had left on Abel's desk, was intact. But the personal copies of William's survey records the duplicate said he had kept through a professional habit that had always struck her as excessive were missing. She stood in her small room holding the empty leather case that had held the documents and felt the shape of what had happened resolve into clarity. Dutch had known what she was carrying before she had opened the envelope herself. He had been watching, noting, assessing since the first evening he arrived. He had waited until she revealed what she had, and then he had taken what he could reach. She carried the empty case to the kitchen. She set it on the work table. She stood with both hands flat on the wood and thought very carefully. The original documents were filed in federal offices in Helena and Columbus. Victor Crane could not reach those. The certified summary was on Abel's desk and had not been touched. Dutch had taken the personal copies. He had not taken the summary. Because he had not known about the summary until this morning, and by the time he understood what it meant, he was already committed to taking what he could get quickly rather than risking being found. She had the summary. She had the knowledge of what the federal records contain. She had her own testimony as William's wife and working partner about every document he had ever filed. They had taken the paper. They had not taken her. She straightened. She picked up the lamp and walked to Abel's office. "Dutch is gone," she said. "He took William's personal copies, but he didn't take the summary." She set the empty case on Abel's desk beside the certified document. And there is no piece of paper he can steal that undoes what William filed in Helena and Columbus 3 years ago. The federal record exists whether Victor Crane has our copy or not. Abel looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his face that she did not often see there. Not admiration exactly, but the recognition that a thing has been correctly handled. Cole still needs to ride to Helena, he said. Immediately, she agreed, before Crane can send someone to try to complicate things at the federal office. She looked at the certified summary on his desk. And I need to give Harrison Wells a sworn statement about Williams' work, what he recorded, what the federal file contains. I helped him prepare every document he ever filed. I can testify to the contents of that record as well as any man in this territory. Abel placed the certified summary carefully in the center of his desk. Crane is going to move fast when he understands what we have, he said. Yes, she said. So should we. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall on the Bitterroot Mountains, soft and patient, and entirely indifferent to the plans of men and women in the valley below. It covered the kitchen garden and the rose canes and the yard and the mountain road and the creek's banks with the same democratic whiteness, making everything new and undifferentiated and temporarily peacefully equal. It would melt by noon. The ground would be hard by evening. And by the time Cole Stoneridge saddled his horse in the first light and rode south toward the Helena Road, the situation that had been building for 3 years, around one family's right to the water running through their land, had arrived at the moment where everything that happened next would determine everything that came after. Victor Crane arrived on a Wednesday morning, 2 days after Dutch had ridden south in the pre-dawn dark with William's personal documents folded inside his coat. Rose was alone in the trading post when he came through the door. Cole had left for Helena 2 days prior before Crane's men had begun moving, taking the mountain road south before first light, with the certified summary sewn into the lining of his vest, and Harrison Wells's name written on a folded paper in his breast pocket. Ethan was in the south pasture with Grant and 3 of the hands repairing fence sections that the first snow had revealed as inadequate. Abel was at the far barn. Silas Vance was cutting wood behind the bunkhouse. Chet was with him. Rose was alone working through the winter supply ledger when the door opened. Victor Crane was 52 years old, compact and carefully dressed in the expensive wool of a man who wants you to understand immediately that he can afford expensive wool. He was not physically imposing. He did not need to be. The 8 riders visible through the trading post window provided that function, sitting their horses in the yard with the patience of men who have been paid to wait and are comfortable with it. He looked around the trading post with the assessing eye of a man who has walked into many establishments and calculated their value before he finished crossing the threshold. He looked at the shelves at the account books on the counter at the window behind Rose that faced toward the main house. Then he looked at Rose. Mrs. Whitfield, he said. His voice was smooth, educated, carrying the particular register of someone who has spent decades in rooms where his word resolved things. I think we can speak plainly with each other. He set a leather satchel on the counter between them. It made a solid sound that indicated its contents were not paper. There's $1,500 in that bag, he said, for your cooperation, specifically for your departure from this territory. Permanently. He said it the way you'd quote a price at market, reasonable and final. I'm a practical man, Mrs. Whitfield. The documents your husband prepared are a complication, but complications can be managed. What cannot be easily managed is a woman with direct knowledge of their contents, willing to stand in a federal courtroom. I'd prefer to resolve this without that. The counter was between them. On Rose's side of it, the supply ledger and ink bottle, the pen she had set down when he came in, and in the drawer below the counter surface, the single-shot Derringer that Abel Stoneridge had placed there on her 3rd day at Stoneridge with the instruction that the trading post occasionally received visitors whose intentions were commercial in a different sense than the business intended. She had practiced with it twice in the yard enough to know what it was and what it cost to use it. She was not thinking about the Derringer. She was thinking about William, who had spent a summer in this valley measuring it honestly and recording what he found. She was thinking about Abel, who had built everything visible through the trading post windows over 30 years of straight dealing and hard work. She was thinking about the roses in the kitchen garden, coming back from 2 years of neglect because someone had decided they were worth the effort. She thought about all of this in approximately 3 seconds. No, she said. Crane looked at her with the expression of a man who has encountered a word he did not expect in this context. Mrs. Whitfield. His voice retained its smoothness with the effort of long practice. Let me be direct about what you are positioned against. I have operated in this territory for 11 years. I have resources and relationships that... And let me be direct about what you are positioned against, she said. Her voice came out steady in a way that surprised her slightly. You sent a man into this household to gather information and steal documents. That is federal crime because those documents were federal property. You have been applying pressure to a territorial court whose presiding judge has a son on your payroll. That is corruption of a territorial judicial proceeding. And you are now standing in this trading post offering money to a potential federal witness to leave the territory. She placed both hands flat on the counter. Everything you have done in the past 4 minutes is a reason for a federal judge to find against you before I've said a single word about my husband's survey work. So I would suggest you take your bag and leave this building. The silence that followed had a specific texture, the silence of a room where something has shifted, and everyone present is deciding what the shift means. Crane looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze without moving. Then Abel Stoneridge's voice came from the doorway behind Crane. You've had your answer. Crane turned. Abel stood in the doorway, his old Sharps rifle held in the manner of a man who is not pointing it at anyone, but whose hands are positioned in a way that makes the next movement require very little. He was 62 years old, and he looked in that moment precisely as old as the mountains behind him. Crane picked up his leather satchel. He looked at Rose one final time, and what she saw in his eyes was not anger but calculation, a man adjusting his plan rather than abandoning it. He left. The 8 riders in the yard turned their horses and followed him south. Rose remained at the counter with her hands flat on the wood for a long moment after the sound of the horses faded. Then she became aware that her hands were not shaking and found this interesting. Abel came to stand on the other side of the counter. He looked at her the way he looked at things he was making an honest assessment of. What you just did, he said. It needed doing, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Agnes would have done exactly that. He said, which from Abel Stoneridge was not a comparison but a category of the highest order. He turned toward the door. I need to send a rider after Cole. He needs to know Crane's been here and that we should expect him to move faster now. He left. Rose stood in the empty trading post and listened to the mountain wind against the windows and the sound of Clearwater Creek carrying water over stones. It had been running over since before anyone in this valley had arrived or would remain. Cole reached Helena in 2 days, riding hard on a mountain road that had not yet decided whether it was autumn or winter, and was expressing this ambivalence in ice and mud in equal measure. Harrison Wells received him in an office above a hardware store on the main street, a dry and precise man of 60 who had been a federal circuit judge for 20 years before retiring to private practice, with the observation that justice was better served by competent attorneys than by the arbitrary luck of judicial assignment. He read the certified summary twice. He read William Whitfield's letter once, then set it down with the care of someone handling something that belongs to a category beyond the merely legal. The federal record exists in both Helena and Columbus, Cole said. I know it does, Wells said. I've been trying to access it for 8 months. Crane's contacts in the Territorial Land Office have been obstructing the inquiry. They cannot obstruct a federal court order, which is what I intend to file before this day is out. He looked up from the documents. Your sister-in-law. She's not yet, Cole said, but she will be. The woman who prepared these records, who can testify to their contents. Yes. I'll need her sworn statement. She expected that, Cole said. She said to tell you she helped William Whitfield prepare every federal document he ever filed, and that she can testify to the contents of the Montana Territory Survey record as accurately as any man who was present. Wells looked at the certified summary one more time. Then he put it in a drawer, locked the drawer, and reached for his pen. "Tell Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "that I'll have the court order for the federal records by tomorrow morning and a hearing date by the end of the week. And tell Abel Stoneridge that 30 years of honest dealing in that valley is about to receive the documentation it should have had a long time ago." Crane did not wait for the courts. Rose understood this about him from the morning he had stood in the trading post. He was not a man who accepted the legal process as the final word when the legal process was about to go against him. He had operated for 11 years in Montana territory by moving faster than opposition could organize, and when organization was imminent, he moved faster still. The harassment of the previous weeks, the cut fence lines and the fouled waterhole, had been reconnaissance. What came on the Friday night of that week was something different in kind. Rose woke at 3 in the morning to the sound of too many horses moving too fast in the wrong direction. She was dressed and at the kitchen window with the rifle from the corner before her mind had fully cataloged what her body had already decided. Through the glass riders coming from the north, more than a dozen moving with a purposeful spread of men who have been briefed on a layout and are moving to assigned positions. Lantern light from the bunkhouse, where someone had already raised the alarm. Grant's voice carrying across the yard. Abel and Silas Vance moving from the main house toward the barn. Ethan came from the direction of the south barn at a run, took in the situation in one sweeping look, and began giving orders in the low, controlled voice of a man whose register does not change under pressure. She heard her name mentioned. She heard Grant say with the flatness of someone reporting a known fact, "She won't go." He was correct. She took the rifle. She moved to the position at the kitchen window that gave the widest angle on the approaches to the trading post, and she stayed there. What followed was not the clean exchange of a story told afterward, but the actual texture of violence at night, the crack of rifle fire from multiple directions, the specific chaos of men moving in darkness with incomplete information about where other men are, the noise of horses responding to shots and riders trying to manage that response, and underneath it all, the constant calculation of a mind trying to understand what is happening and where the critical failure points are. Rose tracked it from the window. Crane's men had come in two groups, one pressing from the north against the bunkhouse and barn position, where Ethan and Silas were holding, and a second moving around the western side toward the trading post itself. She could see their lantern moving through the tree line, and she could see what they were carrying. A torch. They intended to fire the trading post. She had approximately 90 seconds. She did not think about this. She went out the kitchen back door into the November night air that hit her like cold water, moving low and fast across the open ground between the house and the western tree line, taking the angle that the darkness gave her rather than the angle she would have preferred. The man with the torch was mounted, approaching the corner of the trading post at a walk, not expecting opposition from this direction. She fired once, not at the man, but ahead of his horse, close enough that the sound and the muzzle flash sent the animal sideways in genuine panic. The rider lost his seat. The torch went down into the frozen mud and went out with the inglorious finality of fire encountering wet earth. From the barn corner, a second shot from Grant, who had seen what she was doing and covered the angle she could not cover herself. The rider on the ground scrambled to his feet and ran for the tree line. Rose pressed her back against the wall of the trading post and let out the breath she had been holding since the kitchen door. Above her, through the trading post window, she could see the lamp she had left burning on the counter, the ledger she had been working on before sleep, the drawer where the derringer was, all of it intact. She went back inside. She took the position at the front window and watched the north yard where the main exchange was still happening, and she waited. The thing that ended it came from a direction no one inside the Stoneridge compound had expected. From the northern tree line behind Crane's men, a second set of rifle shots rang out, not directed at the Stoneridge defenders, directed at Crane's formation into the rear of the men who had been pressing the bunkhouse. Confusion spread through Crane's force with the speed that confusion always spreads through people who are in the wrong and beginning to understand the geometry of that. The men at the bunkhouse line, pressed from behind by an unknown force, began to lose their coherence. 7 men from Clearwater Ridge had ridden up the mountain road in the dark with rifles and the particular determination of neighbors who have lived long enough in proximity to understand that an attack on one family in a valley is a statement about all families in that valley. Silas Vance had sent a rider to town 2 days before when the shape of what was coming had become clear to him with the certainty of a man who has been reading trouble for 50 years. He had sent the rider quietly without announcement because he had been in this valley long enough to know which men would come and which would not, and he had sent word only to the ones who would. And with them in the dark, at the edge of the tree line, were Dutch and Reeves. Reeves had left Stonebridge 2 days after Dutch, taking the south road at a walk rather than a run, which was the difference between a man who has made a decision and a man who is still making one. He found Dutch at a way station 12 miles from the Crane camp. Dutch looked at him for a long moment when he rode up. He did not ask questions. Some things are legible without explanation. Together they had gone to Silas Vance's town contacts, and together they had taken their position at the tree line when the night came because the position was tactically correct, and because Reeves had turned the work gloves over in his hands long enough to know which side of this fight he intended to be on. Dutch had ridden to Crane's operation with Williams' documents and collected his payment. He had spent the better part of 2 days in Crane's camp listening to the plans being made for a Friday night removal of the problem at Stonebridge, and he had arrived somewhere in those 2 days at the border of a decision that had been waiting for him for longer than he had been working for Crane. He was not a good man. He understood this about himself with the clarity that certain kinds of lives eventually produce an accurate accounting of the ledger without any particular illusion about its balance. He had done things for money that he did not think about in daylight. But there were things on the other side of the ledger, too smaller and less dramatic, and one of them was Abel Stonebridge pressing a pair of work gloves into Reeves's hands on a cold morning because he had noticed that Reeves's hands were cracking. It was a small thing. It was the kind of small thing that a man like Abel Stonebridge did without thinking, because it was the obvious right action, because the other man's hands were damaged, and he had gloves to give. Dutch had watched it happen from 15 feet away and had not thought about it consciously again until he was sitting in Crane's camp listening to men discuss the most efficient way to end what the Stonebridge family had built over 30 years, and the memory of the gloves arrived without invitation and would not leave. He did not pretend to himself that what he did that Friday night was heroism. He went to Silas Vance's town contacts because it was the available action, and he brought Reeves because Reeves had already decided, and he took the position at the tree line because the position was tactically correct. He did not examine his own motivations too carefully. He had found in experience that motivations rarely survive that kind of examination intact. Victor Crane, directing his men from the northern edge of the property, had his horse rear when the counterattack from his rear flank threw everything into chaos. He went down in the frozen mud of the north pasture with the undignified impact of a man whose plan has just collapsed, and he was not given time to recover his footing before Ethan Stonebridge was there. And beside Ethan Rose. She had come out of the trading post when the shooting from the tree line started understanding that the geometry had changed, moving toward where she calculated Ethan would be. She arrived in time to see Crane on the ground, see Ethan standing over him, and see the pistol that Crane was reaching for. She had the rifle. The angle was clear. She fired. She hit his gun hand at the distance that required hitting his gun hand, and she did not miss. Crane's pistol spun into the darkness. Crane made a sound and clutched his hand to his chest. Abel arrived from the left, his old sharps, finding Crane's spine from behind. "It's over, Victor," Abel said in the voice of a man delivering a verdict that had been a long time coming. Crane said nothing. There was nothing left to say that the night had not already said for him. In the hours that followed, Crane was secured to wait for the federal marshal whom Cole had already put in motion from Helena. His hired men, without their employer's direction and facing odds that had equalized in a direction they had not expected, made the practical calculation that cowboys and hired guns have made since the beginning of organized conflict. This is no longer the arrangement I agreed to, and I am going to leave it. They left. The 7 men from Clearwater Ridge, with the quiet satisfaction of a job correctly done, saw them to the road and waited until the sound of horses faded entirely before turning back to the Stonebridge compound. Chet, who had positioned himself at the barn corner and maintained it throughout with a steadiness that would become part of the story told about that night for years afterward, was found to have a graze on his left arm that he was attempting to conceal with the stoicism of a 17-year-old who has decided this is the night he is no longer 17 in any meaningful sense. Rose cleaned and dressed the wound while Chet looked at the ceiling and did not make a sound. "You did well tonight," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said with the careful dignity of someone who has decided not to ruin the moment by adding to it. Dutch came to the kitchen door after the compound was secure in the hour before dawn, when the shapes of things were beginning to come back out of the dark. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and looked at Rose with the expression of a man who has arrived at a reckoning he has been avoiding for some time. "I'll testify," he said, "about the damn Crane was planning on the North Fork, about the bribes to the territorial court, about everything he paid me to find out." He paused. "I took his money. I'm not going to pretend I didn't, but I'm going to say what I know for what it's worth." "It's worth a great deal," Rose said, "to the federal case." He nodded once. He started to turn away, then stopped. "The documents I took, I left them with Crane. He'll have burned them by now." "We don't need them," she said. "We have what we need." He looked at her for a moment longer with the expression of a man trying to locate the right thing to say and finding that the right thing was nothing. And so he nodded again and went out into the pre-dawn dark. Reeves, when asked later what had made the difference, looked at the pair of work gloves on the nail beside his bunk and said, "Nothing big, just a small thing." The Federal Circuit hearing convened in Clearwater Ridge 2 weeks after the night of the attack, conducted by a judge named Harlan Price, who had traveled from Helena with the particular efficiency of a federal appointee who has been told that a matter has been allowed to remain unresolved for longer than it should have been. He reviewed William Whitfield's certified summary. He reviewed the federal record retrieved by court order from the land office in Helena, which matched the summary in every particular, because William Whitfield had been that kind of man. He heard Rose's sworn testimony about the survey work delivered in the straightforward manner of someone who has prepared every document being discussed and is therefore not guessing at their contents. He heard Dutch's testimony about Crane's interference with the territorial court. He heard Harrison Wells present the full case with the methodical thoroughness of a former judge who knows exactly what evidence needs to be where. He retired to consider his ruling for 4 hours. He returned with 2 pages of findings. Abel Stoneridge's original homestead claim of 1852, documented by federal survey and confirmed by the records of 2 separate federal land offices, established prior right to the waters of Clearwater Creek by 17 years over any subsequent claim. All conflicting claims filed by Crane Timber and Land Company were dismissed. Victor Crane was remanded to federal custody on charges of judicial corruption, witness intimidation, and interference with federal proceedings. Additional charges relating to the night attack were referred to the territorial marshal. Judge Price looked up from his papers at the end of the reading. "This matter," he said in a voice that suggested he had reviewed a great many matters and had opinions about the quality of this one's management, "should have been resolved in this fashion 3 years ago. The record existed. It simply needed someone who knew where to look for it and what to do with it when they found it." He looked briefly at Rose, who was sitting beside Abel in the front row of the room that Clearwater Ridge used as a courtroom when it needed one, and then he looked back at his papers and said nothing further. He did not need to. Winter came properly then, as Montana winters do, without apology and without interest in the plans of the people who live under them. The snow closed the high mountain roads and shortened the days to a thin wedge of gray light between long darks. The trading post managed its winter custom with the steady rhythm of necessity. The kitchen produced 3 meals a day for 12 people and occasionally more when travelers were caught by weather and needed a place to be. Rose learned to milk Blossom, the ranch's brown and white dairy cow, in a process that required 3 weeks of daily negotiation before arriving at something that could be called an understanding. Blossom expressed her philosophical reservations about the arrangement with consistent vocal commentary that the ranch hands found entertaining and that Rose found educational in the particular way that animals teach you things You did not know you needed to learn about patience. Ethan chopped extra wood for the kitchen without being asked. He appeared in the doorway most evenings after supper, not imposing, simply present, available for whatever conversation was natural. They talked about the ranch, about the spring planting, about the books on his shelf that she had been working through with the systematic pleasure of someone reunited with a form of abundance she had gone without for months. They talked about Agnes's roses and what would be required to bring them back properly. They talked occasionally about William and about the particular quality of grief that had changed its texture over the months from something sharp and constant into something that was still present but had found its proper place in the architecture of who she was now. He was courting her with the patient precision he brought to everything, and she was allowing it. And the winter moved around this the way winters move around. Things that are taking their time, covering everything, equally making no distinctions, waiting. The question came in February on an evening when the snow was falling past the kitchen window in the slow, patient way of weather that has no urgency because it has all the time the season gives it. Ethan was at the kitchen table with a broken piece of harness he was mending, and Rose was at the stove with the bread she had started that morning, and the kitchen smelled of wood smoke and rising dough, and the particular warmth of a room that has been regularly inhabited by people who find being in it a good use of their time. He set down the harness. "I'm not going to make a production of this," he said, which was accurate and which she appreciated. "You know what I'm asking. I've been making it plain for 3 months." She turned from the stove. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not as the cook, as my wife, as the person this house has been waiting for since before either of us arrived at that store in October." He held her gaze with the steadiness that was his most essential quality. "I know what I am. I'm a man of few words and too much silence and work that doesn't stop because the season changes. I know what this life is. You've been living it for 4 months and you know it better than Catherine ever did because you actually looked at it." He paused. "I can promise you that I'll spend whatever time I have trying to deserve the answer I'm hoping for. That's the best honest accounting I can give." She crossed the kitchen and stood in front of him and put her hand against his face, the rough jaw and the weathered skin, and looked at him with the full attention of someone who has made a decision. "Yes, Ethan Stoneridge," she said. "Yes to everything." Chet, who had been tasked with bringing a message to the kitchen and had arrived at the window at an inopportune moment, managed to contain himself for approximately 4 seconds before the whoop escaped him and was heard in the bunkhouse. By breakfast the following morning, every person at Stone Ridge Ranch knew. By the noon meal, the news had reached Clearwater Ridge via the supply rider who went to town Thursdays. By the end of the week, Mrs. Hartwell had sent up a jar of preserved plums and a note that said, "Finally, A.H." April arrived the way spring arrives in the Bitterroots decisively overnight, with the extravagance of a season that has been waiting behind winter for 6 months and intends to make its presence known. The snow pulled back up the mountain faces. The creek ran high and cold and clear with meltwater. The kitchen garden showed the first green of returning life, and among the rose canes the thin red growth of Agnes Stoneridge's most particular legacy. The wedding was set for the first Saturday with weather that could be relied upon, which turned out to be the 12th of April, a day that the Bitterroot Mountains cooperated with in the manner of a landscape that has its own opinions about what deserves good conditions. Abel came to Rose's room the morning of the wedding with a small wooden box he carried in both hands. Inside was a hair comb of Irish origin, delicate set with small seed pearls, the kind of thing that travels across an ocean and a continent in the bottom of a trunk belonging to a woman determined to bring beauty with her wherever she is going. "This was Agnes's mother's," he said. "Agnes kept it for an occasion worthy of it." He looked at the comb in the box, then at Rose. "Ethan has been happier in the last 4 months than I've seen him since before we lost her. That's your doing." He set the box in her hands. "She would have wanted you to have something that was hers." Emotion arrived in Rose's throat in the manner of things that have been held back for the right moment and recognize it. She took the comb and held it carefully. "Thank you," she said. Abel placed the comb in her hair with the awkward care of a man unused to such tasks, but committed to doing them properly. Then he offered his arm. "Let's not keep that boy waiting any longer," he said. "He's been pacing the yard since sunup." The ceremony was held in the yard of Stone Ridge Trading Post, which had been transformed by the combined effort of every person on the property and a significant contribution from the women of Clearwater Ridge, who had opinions about decoration and the means to act on them. Wildflowers from every pasture Cole and Grant could reach were in every jar bottle and tin vessel that the trading post and kitchen could produce. Ribbons from the supplies traded during winter connected the porch posts in a way that was festive and slightly haphazard in the manner of an installation managed partly by Grant and partly by Chet, neither of whom had prior experience. Half the county had come, because this was the kind of story that a county pays attention to, the kind that starts with a woman's hand sliding a wedding ring across a store counter in October and ends here in April with the mountains at her back and the creek running clear on the eastern edge of the property that would be hers in the fullest sense of that word before the morning was finished. Ethan stood at the end of the aisle, formed by the guests, with the slight stiffness of a man wearing his best jacket and the complete stillness of someone who has stopped whatever he was doing the moment he saw her emerge from the house. Cole stood beside him, maintaining a gravity that was entirely genuine and only occasionally undermined by the dimensions of his expression. Grant, stationed with the flowers, had decorated Blossom in deference to some private logic. The cow stood beside the fence in her ribbons with the serenity of an animal that has long since made its peace with the inexplicable. The minister was brief as requested. When he asked if anyone objected, a meadowlark on the fence post volunteered an opinion that broke the solemnity in exactly the way that solemnity sometimes needs to be broken, and the laughter that moved through the assembled guests was the sound of people who are genuinely happy for the two people at the front of the yard and feel no need to disguise it. Ethan slid the plain gold band onto her finger with steady hands. It was simple, unadorned, solid, and true. She thought of the ring of Williams that sat in Abel's drawer in the trading post, and she thought of William himself, who had surveyed this valley and recorded it honestly, and written a careful letter that he sealed and entrusted to the woman he loved. And she thought that he would have recognized this day for what it was, the honest record of something real documented by the presence of everyone in this yard, permanent in the way that witness truths are permanent. The kiss was thorough enough to produce a sound from Chet that carried to the tree line. Late in the afternoon, when the dancing was in its fourth hour and the supply of Silas Vance's corn liquor had reached the stage of the evening where the dancing became more ambitious and less accurate, Ethan took Rose's hand and led her up the small hill behind the trading post. 3 crosses stood in the long grass, simple and sufficient. Agnes Stoneridge. And beside her, the 2 ranch hands lost in the rock fall of the first hard winter. The wild grass had grown up around the markers through the autumn and had been pressed flat by snow and was now rising again with the spring, the particular pale green of new growth that contains the memory of everything that has grown there before. Rose knelt and placed her wedding bouquet against Agnes's marker. Mountain wildflowers bound with a ribbon from her hair. "I'll take care of them," she said, not performing it, saying it the way you say things to people who matter, which is directly and without ornament. "Your husband, your sons, this land you loved, the roses you kept alive when they had no business surviving." She paused. "I'll tend it all the way you would have wanted." The wind moved through the long grass around the crosses. In the valley below, the sound of the fiddle reached them faintly, and the voices of people celebrating, and underneath both of those, the constant low conversation of Clearwater Creek over its stones. Ethan stood behind her with his hands resting on her shoulders. She rose and turned and leaned into him, and felt the solid warmth of someone who is entirely present in a moment that they have decided deserves their full attention. "No regrets," he said. She considered the question honestly, which was the only way she knew how to consider anything. She thought about October, about the hand that did not tremble, about a counter and a ring and 7 words that had rearranged the next 6 months of her life, before she had the information to understand what rearrangement meant. She thought about a carpet bag carried across 3 states with a sealed envelope at the bottom that turned out to contain the thing a family needed, waiting in the dark for the right moment in the right hands. She thought about William, who had been here in this valley before she was, who had measured its water and recorded its truth, and fed one evening at the table of the man who built this place, and who had not known that any of this would follow, but had done his work with the care that made it possible. None, she said. Not one. I'd have found you, he said. Somehow, some things are meant to be Rose Stoneridge. Her name in his mouth was the name she had become, not in replacement of everything before it, but in continuation of it, the surveyor's wife, who became the woman this mountain shaped from grief and winter and the particular stubbornness of someone who would not trade her memories away, who learned instead to carry them differently. They stood on the hill until the sun completed its descent behind the Bitterroot Peaks, and the sky moved through the amber and rose and deep purple that high altitude makes possible, and the valley below them filled with the blue shadow of evening. Then they walked back down together, hand in hand toward the light and the music and the people who had become in the months since October the shape of what her life was now. Much later in the quiet that settled over the Stoneridge compound, after the last guests had made their way home or found accommodations in the barn that had been prepared for the purpose, Rose stood alone in the kitchen. She had sent Ethan up the stairs ahead of her, telling him she needed a few minutes, and he had accepted this without question, because he was the kind of man who understands that some moments belong to a person alone. The kitchen was quiet in the way that places quiet after they have held a great deal of life and sound. The stove was banked, the surfaces were clean. The wildflower arrangements from the day's celebration occupied every windowsill and counter edge. Through the kitchen window, the April night was doing what Montana April nights do when they are feeling generous, filling the sky with stars so numerous and so bright that the mountain peaks showed in silhouette against them. She went to the drawer in the sideboard. Abel's drawer in her mind, the place where he kept the spare candles and the good matches and the small things that needed a reliable home. She opened it. She took William's ring from her pocket, where she had been carrying it since Columbus, where it had been through 10,000 miles of the particular country that follows the end of a life that was supposed to go on longer than it did. She held it in the lamplight for a moment, the plain gold of it, the weight of a careful man's savings and a careful man's love, and a careful man's work that had survived him by years and arrived in the end at exactly the place it needed to arrive. She placed it in the drawer. She placed it on the small piece of velvet she had cut from the hem of Agnes's blue dress, which she had worn to the Harvest Festival in November. She placed it carefully, the way you place things that have earned their rest. She was not discarding it. She was not losing it. She was not trading it for anything because it was not for trade and never had been. She was giving it a home, which was the right thing to give something that had been carried long enough. She closed the drawer. She stood in her kitchen and looked at the window and the stars beyond it, at the outline of the mountains that had asked everything of her and given back something she had not known she needed. At the creek that ran clean and cold on the eastern edge of the property, that was hers and Ethan's, documented honestly by a careful man who had come through this valley 3 years before either of them arrived and written down the truth of what he found. Gold was not what these mountains needed. She had known this since October, when a quiet man with amber eyes had said the words in a general store and meant them exactly. She knew it more completely now, standing in the kitchen she had claimed from neglect and made into the heart of a home, with a mountain outside the window and a family asleep in the house behind her, and a year's worth of becoming the person this place had needed between that October morning and this April night. She turned off the lamp. She went upstairs. Behind her in the kitchen, in the sideboard drawer on its small piece of velvet, William Whitfield's ring rested in the dark. Not lost, not forgotten, not traded away. Set down at last in a place of honor, because the woman who had carried it had somewhere to put it now, and someone to be, and a life being built that did not require her to carry the past on her finger to prove that what it represented was real and mattered and would always matter. Outside, Clearwater Creek ran over its stones in the dark, cold and clear. the way it had been running since before anyone in this valley had a word for it. The Bitterroot Mountains stood over everything with the patience of things that measure time differently than people do that have watched 1,000 seasons of building and loss and building again and expect to watch 1,000 more. In the morning, there would be a fire to start and bread to begin and coffee to brew strong enough to wake men who worked from first light to last. There would be a garden to tend and roses to coax back and accounts to keep and a trading post to run and a family to feed and all the ordinary daily work of a life that had been chosen with full knowledge of what it cost and what it offered in return. There would be all of it waiting for morning, and in the morning, Rose Stoneridge would be there.